In the autumn of 1902, in the high plains country of eastern Colorado, where the Burlington route had laid 300 miles of iron between Pueblo and the Kansas line, a young woman named Nora Finch walked the length of an abandoned siding outside the depot town of Creston and stopped in front of something nobody else had wanted. It sat at the far end of the siding, past two cattle cars that still smelled of their last use and a flatbed whose deck had begun to cup and split. The car was a Class B40 boxcar, 40 feet from coupling to coupling, its sliding door sealed with a hasped padlock, the color of old blood. The exterior boards had weathered from their original oxide red to a dry pale rust, and the iron running gear beneath had seized into something like permanence. Weeds had grown up through the wheels and hardened there over the course of several seasons. The stenciling along the upper edge of the car's side was still legible in the flat autumn light. It read, Colorado and Southern Railway, Freight Division, and below that, a car number. Nothing else. Nora was 27 years old and had arrived in Creston 6 weeks earlier with $41, a canvas roll of her grandfather's tools, and no particular expectation of welcome. She had found work at the freight depot, keeping tally for the station master, a man named Colbert, who paid her half what he'd have paid a man for the same hours, and seemed to believe this was generous. She had taken the work because it kept her close to the one thing she understood well enough to trust. Her grandfather, Amos Finch, had worked locks for 31 years out of a shop in Salida. He had not only cut keys and fit cylinders, he had studied every mechanism that sealed a thing against the world. He said, on more occasions than Nora could count, that a lock was a letter written in iron, and that if you read it carefully enough, it would tell you what it was keeping. He had taught her the language, pin by pin, spring by spring, from the time she was 8 years old. Amos had died in the spring of 1899. He had left the shop to a nephew who knew nothing about locks and sold the inventory inside a year. He had left Nora the tools and the knowledge and a single piece of counsel she had carried since. The thing no one can open is the thing most worth opening. The railroad siding sale had been announced in a notice tacked to the depot wall. The Burlington was clearing its secondary yards across 3 counties, selling off rolling stock that had been condemned or simply forgotten. Most of the lots went to scrap dealers from Pueblo and a handful of stock farmers who could use the flatbeds for feed storage. The Class B40 at the end of the siding generated one comment from the auctioneer, a heavyset man named Pruitt who had driven out from Colorado Springs for the day. He said that the car had been sitting on that siding since before he had started working for the railroad, and that the door was sealed with a lock nobody in the district had been able to open, and that whoever bought it was welcome to whatever was inside, assuming anything was. The men at the auction laughed at this. Nora did not. She waited until the lot was opened, bid $4 when Pruitt called for an opening price, and heard no second bid. Pruitt wrote her name in his ledger with the particular flatness a man uses when he has decided a transaction is beneath his interest in it. She owned the car before the afternoon was out. There is a specific quality to the way a crowd of men will fail to be curious about something. It is not ignorance exactly, and it is not laziness. It is a prior decision, made before any examination, that the thing in question has been correctly valued by whoever last dismissed it. The men at that auction had not looked at the car the way Nora looked at it. They had looked at it the way Pruitt had framed it, which was as a sealed nuisance no one had been able to make useful. They were not wrong that it was sealed. They were wrong about what that meant. If you have ever held something in your hands that nobody wanted and felt the weight of what might be inside it, leave a thought in the comments below. She knew that feeling in her bones. The lock was the first thing she examined, and she did not rush it. It was a 6-lever mechanism, British manufacture by its profile, the kind that had been imported in quantity by the Western railroads through the 1880s for use on high-value freight cars. The keyway was partially occluded by corrosion, but not blocked. The shackle had been through the hasp at an angle, which was unusual, and the hasp itself had been bent slightly downward, and then apparently straightened again, not by the hand that bent it, but by some subsequent and less practiced effort. Someone had tried to force the hasp at some point after the car was sealed. The attempt had been abandoned. Nora did not try to force anything. She took the lock off the hasp entirely because the hasp screws had corroded into the wood, and she could work them out without difficulty. And she carried the lock to the small room off the depot freight office, where she ate her lunch and kept her grandfather's tools. She worked on it for 3 evenings. The first evening she cleaned it, dissolving 9 years of compacted grit from the keyway with a preparation of her grandfather's that used coal oil and a specific proportion of tallow, applied on a wire probe thin as a pin. She did not try to open it that night. She let the preparation work and set the lock on the windowsill. The second evening she read it. She inserted a tension wrench of her grandfather's, a piece of flat spring steel ground to exactly the right width for a 6-lever mechanism, and began to feel for the lever positions one by one. Amos had taught her this the same way he had taught her everything, not as a trick but as a conversation. The lock was speaking. She was listening. By the time the light went, she had mapped 4 of the 6 levers and understood the mechanism's particular history. The lock had been rekeyed at some point after its original manufacture, done competently but with a blank that was not quite the right alloy, and the false set on the 3rd lever was the giveaway. Someone had wanted this lock to be specific. Someone had made a key for it that was not the original. The 3rd evening she cut the key. She used a piece of key stock from her grandfather's roll, measured the lever heights against the marks she had made on a thin strip of lead, and filed the key with a needle file, working by the feel of the metal against the leverage and not by eye. It took her 1 hour and 40 minutes. When she turned the key in the lock, the shackle lifted with a sound like a held breath, finally released. She stood there for a moment with the open lock in her hand and didn't go to the car that night. There is a quality of patience that is different from delay. Delay is what a person does when they are afraid. Patience is what a person does when they understand that the moment of opening deserves to be met with full attention and not with the failing light of an autumn evening. Nora went back to her room at the boarding house and slept without difficulty and rose before dawn. She reached the siding at first light, when the sky above the plains was the color of old iron and the frost on the rail ties had not yet begun to melt. She hung the open lock on the hasp to keep its position, gripped the sliding door's handle with both hands, and pulled. The door had swollen into its frame over 9 years of moisture and drought, cycling through the wood. It didn't want to move. She braced her boot against the car's sideboards and pulled again, feeling the resistance in her shoulders and then in the wood itself, a long, low groan that seemed to rise up from the ground. The door moved 2 inches. She repositioned, got a better grip, and pulled a 3rd time with everything she had, and the door let go. The air that came out was cold and still and carried the smell of old paper, machine oil, a faint mineral sharpness that Nora associated with iron in a sealed space. It was the air of a room that had been waiting, and she stood at the threshold and let it pass over her before she stepped up. The interior of the car was dim, lit only by the growing morning through the open door. When her eyes adjusted, she saw that it was not empty. Along the left wall, secured to the car's interior framing with iron brackets, stood a row of 6 wooden crates, each approximately 3 feet on a side, their lids nailed shut and their surfaces stenciled with the same car number that appeared on the exterior. On the floor between the crates and the right wall ran a narrow passage, and at the far end of the car, secured to the end wall, was a writing desk of the folding type used by railroad accounting offices, its surface still bearing a leather blotter, an inkwell sealed with wax, and a brass nameplate from which the name had been removed, leaving only the shadow of letters in the tarnished metal. Nora stood in that passage for a long time without touching anything. The dust on the surfaces was undisturbed. The blotter was still aligned. The crates had not shifted. Whatever had happened outside this car in the 9 years since 1893, nothing had happened inside it. It was a room in which time had simply stopped, and she was the first person to step across the threshold since the door was sealed. She went to the desk first. The inkwell was dry, but the wax seal had preserved it against the worst of the evaporation, and the leather blotter was cracked but intact. In the center drawer of the desk, which required a small key that she found hung on a wire hook inside the desk's back panel, she found a sheaf of papers folded in thirds and tied with a cord that came apart at the first touch. She carried them to the door where the light was better and unfolded them on the floor of the car and read. What Nora held were 31 documents, dated between January of 1892 and October of 1893. The uppermost 23 were freight manifests of the standard railroad pattern, listing consignor, consignee, cargo description, declared value, and the originating and receiving station agent's signature. The cargo descriptions on all 23 were identical. Agricultural implements, miscellaneous, origin Pueblo, destination Lamar. The declared values ranged from $40 to $60 per manifest. The lower 8 documents were of a different kind. They were ledger sheets in a hand she did not recognize, ruled with columns for date, weight, value, and a column headed with the initials WAF. She had to read the numbers 3 times before she trusted them. The declared value on the standard manifests totaled $1,400 across the 23 shipments. The value recorded in the ledger sheets for the same 23 shipments, keyed by the same dates and car numbers, totaled $31,000. Nora set the papers down and looked at the crates along the left wall. She had a small pry bar in her grandfather's canvas roll, and she used it carefully, working the lid nails out of the nearest crate in sequence rather than forcing them, because she had learned that the way a person opens a thing tells you whether they expect to close it again properly or not. She intended to close it again properly. The crate held machinery parts wrapped in oilcloth, packed in straw that had desiccated to a pale gold. She unwrapped the first piece. It was a gear assembly, cast iron, machined to a tolerance she recognized as higher than most agricultural work required. She turned it over in her hands. Stamped on the flat face of the gear was a maker's mark she had seen before in her grandfather's trade journals. It was not an implement manufacturer. It was a mining equipment foundry out of Denver. She did not need to open all 6 crates to understand what she was looking at. She opened 4 of them and confirmed what the first suggested. The car held industrial mining equipment, gear assemblies and valve housings and precision machine shafts, valued in the ledger sheets at approximately $31,000. Shipped under fraudulent manifests that listed them as low-value agricultural implements to avoid the freight insurance assessment, the customs bonding fee applicable to heavy machinery, and most critically, the duty charged by the Territorial Revenue Office on mining equipment moved between counties. Someone had used this car, and presumably others, to move significant quantities of expensive equipment off the books. Someone had made a great deal of money on the difference between what was declared and what was shipped. And then something had changed in October of 1893, the date of the last ledger entry, and the car had been sealed and pushed to the end of a siding and apparently forgotten. She refolded the papers and set them on the desk and sat on the floor of the car with her back against the end wall and thought about the column headed WAF. There was a man named Walter Aldous Fry who had been the division freight superintendent for the Colorado and Southern out of Pueblo from 1889 until 1894, when he had retired at the age of 51 to a property outside Colorado Springs that was understood locally to be considerably nicer than a railroad superintendent's salary would reasonably support. Nora knew this because Colbert the station master had mentioned Fry twice in her presence, once to note that the man had built a house in the manner of the eastern states, and once to mention, without editorial, that Fry had left the railroad abruptly in the fall of 1893, at about the time the Colorado and Southern had undergone an inspection by the Territorial Revenue Office that had found nothing wrong. The inspection had found nothing wrong because the evidence of what was wrong was sitting in a sealed car on a siding that no one could open. The Colorado and Southern had absorbed the line in 1898, and with the absorption had come a new set of yard records, and the old siding at Creston had been reclassified as decommissioned, and the cars on it had been scheduled for disposal, and the car at the end of the row had been put up for auction with a note that the lock was unsolvable. And so it had passed into her possession for $4 on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1902. She did not go to Colbert. She went to the county recorder's office in Creston, where a woman named Ida Marsh kept the land and business filings, and Nora spent an afternoon with the records going back to 1889. She found what she expected to find. The shipper named on the fraudulent manifests, a company called Mesa Agricultural Supply, had been incorporated in Pueblo in January of 1892 by a single named principal, whose signature she could not fully read, but whose initials she recognized. The company had been dissolved in November of 1893. She went then to the Territorial Revenue Office, which maintained a field office in La Junta, and she went there on her day off and carried the papers with her in a leather satchel that had been her grandfather's. The revenue officer was a methodical man named Briscoe, who had the specific quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of document, and had long since stopped expecting it to arrive. He read the papers twice without speaking. He made notes on a pad. He asked Nora 2 questions. The first was how she had come to possess the car. She explained without elaboration the auction and the $4 and the lock. The second question was whether she had disturbed the contents of the car, other than to open the crates and examine the machinery. She told him she had opened 4 of the 6 crates and removed the oilcloth wrapping from several pieces, and then replaced them. He nodded as if this was the correct answer to the correct examination, and told her he would be in contact. He was in contact within 2 weeks. The Territorial Revenue Office, working with the Colorado and Southern's own records division, and the successor company that had absorbed Mesa Agricultural Supply's assets, had reconstructed the scheme across its 3-year operation. The car at the end of the Creston siding turned out to be not the only car that had been so used, but it was the only one in which the ledger sheets had been left intact. The others had been cleaned out or scrapped. The survival of the documents in the Class B40 was, as Briscoe told her in a letter written in his careful hand, entirely owing to the quality of the lock that had been placed on the door. The lock had kept the evidence safe precisely because no one could open it. The revenue recovery proceeding took 14 months. Walter Aldous Fry was by then 60 years old and living on his property outside Colorado Springs. The proceeding was civil rather than criminal, given the elapsed time and certain complications of jurisdiction. But the outcome was not ambiguous. The territory assessed the back duties, the bonding fees, the insurance fraud penalties, and the compound interest that had accumulated on all of them across 9 years. The figure came to something over $41,000. The property outside Colorado Springs was sufficient to satisfy most of it. Among the claimants in the proceeding was a man named Reed Archer, who had operated a legitimate mining equipment brokerage out of Denver during the same period. He had spent 2 years between 1893 and 1895 attempting to understand why 3 shipments he had paid to send via the Colorado and Southern had arrived short, with no explanation offered and no recourse found, because the manifests showed only agricultural implements at low declared values, and his own records of what he had actually consigned had been dismissed as impossible to reconcile with the railroad's paperwork. The proceeding found in his favor for the shortfall value of those 3 shipments, plus interest, which came to $4,600. He was a quiet man of about 65 by the time the settlement was paid, and he came to Creston once, briefly, to look at the car that had held the proof. Nora was at the siding when he arrived. He walked the length of the car in silence and then stood at the open door for a while without speaking, looking at the desk and the crates, which were still in their original positions, because Briscoe had asked that nothing be removed until the proceeding was concluded. Reed Archer said, without turning from the door, that he had stopped believing anyone would find it. Nora said that it had been there the whole time. He turned then and looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude is what a person offers to someone who did them a favor, and this was not that. It was the expression of someone who has had a thing restored that they had already written off as permanently gone, and who needs a moment to recalibrate the loss. He left on the afternoon train, and she did not see him again. The Colorado and Southern offered Nora a position in the district yard office as a freight auditor, at a salary that was, she later noted to herself, precisely what they would have paid a man. She considered the offer for 4 days and accepted it, because the work was work she understood, and because Creston in 1903 was a reasonable place to be a person who paid attention to what was sealed inside things. Colbert, who had paid her half a man's wages for 6 weeks, said nothing when she left the depot. The men at the auction, to the best of her knowledge, never revisited their failure to bid. The lock she had cut a key for, the 6-lever British mechanism with the recade 3rd lever, she cleaned and oiled and kept. She put it on the windowsill of her room at the boarding house beside her grandfather's canvas roll, and she looked at it in the evenings when the light from the plains came through the glass at a low angle and caught the metal and held it for a moment before the dark came on. There is a kind of justice that arrives not as thunder but as arithmetic. It is not the justice of the courtroom sermon or the public accusation. It is the justice of a number correctly read, a document correctly filed, a mechanism correctly understood by the right hand at the right time. It asks nothing of the person who delivers it except patience, precision, and the willingness to open a thing that nobody else could open. 9 years is a long time for a sealed car to sit at the end of a siding. $31,000 is a great deal of money to hide inside agricultural implements. Walter Aldous Fry had relied on both of those facts for his security, and he had been right to rely on them until the morning a young woman with $4 in her grandfather's tools walked to the far end of a decommissioned siding and decided that an unsolvable lock was exactly the kind of letter worth reading. The key hung beside the lock on the windowsill for the rest of Nora Finch's years in Creston, which were considerable. When the boarding house was finally torn down in 1941, the woman who had run it since 1907 found both items on the windowsill of the room Nora had occupied and kept them in a glass case in the parlor of her own house until she died. Neither item was ever claimed. Neither was ever thrown away. The lock and the key and what they stood for had, by some quiet agreement of the people who knew the story, become the kind of thing a community keeps. Have you ever held something in your hands that the world had discarded and known, before you opened it, that something important was inside? Leave your answer below. If you have a taste for stories of women who open what the world says cannot be opened, there are more of them here, each one sealed until the right hand finds it. The siding at Creston was taken up for scrap metal during the war effort of 1917. The Class B-40 was already gone by then, processed through the Colorado and Southern's rolling stock program 2 years after the proceeding concluded. But the lot where it had sat remained visible for decades afterward as a long, slightly lower strip of earth where the ties had been, running parallel to the main line and ending in nothing, a faint record of where an unused thing had rested in the weeds until it turned out to matter. Creston in September of 1902 was a town of about 800 people, most of them employed by or dependent on the Burlington route depot that had made the town necessary in the first place. The main street ran perpendicular to the tracks and contained a dry goods store, a hardware supply, 2 saloons, a hotel with 12 rooms, and the post office, which was also the telegraph office. The boarding house where Nora lived was on the street behind the hotel, run by a widow named Hatch, who served dinner at 6 and breakfast at 5:30, and had opinions about boarders who came in after 9 in the evening. Nora had come in after 9 exactly twice in the 6 weeks she had been there, both times because Colbert had needed the freight tallies reconciled before morning and had not told her until late afternoon. Mrs. Hatch had said nothing on either occasion. She was a practical woman who understood that useful employment was not governed by clock hands. Nora ate dinner with 3 other boarders, a surveyor named Rudd who was working a section of the Burlington's land grant and would be gone before winter, a telegraph operator named Cross who was barely 20 and homesick and talked more at dinner than the other 3 combined, and an older woman named Palms who had come to Creston to close an estate and had been closing it for 4 months and showed no sign of finishing. They ate together without much ceremony, and the conversation was the ordinary conversation of people who have been thrown together by circumstance and are willing to be civil without being intimate. None of them asked Nora what she had bought at the railroad auction. She had not told Mrs. Hatch about the car either, though Mrs. Hatch had asked in her direct way whether the auction had been worth the trip. Nora had said she had acquired a piece of rolling stock, and Mrs. Hatch had looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who knows when she is being given half an answer and has decided the other half is not her business. The tools her grandfather had left her were arranged in a canvas roll the length of her forearm, each tool in its own sewn pocket. There were 23 tools in the roll. She knew the name and purpose and history of every one of them, and she knew which ones Amos had made himself and which ones he had bought from dealers in St. Louis and Chicago, and which ones had come from the estates of other locksmiths who had preceded him in the trade. The roll smelled of the oil he had used to preserve the metal, a smell she had known since childhood, and she handled it with a precision that was also, in its way, a form of address. The tension wrench she had used on the 3rd evening was one Amos had ground himself from a piece of clock spring steel. He had made 3 of them in his life, calibrated to the 3 most common keyway widths in use on Western Railroad hardware, and he had shown Nora the process of making them when she was 12, and had watched her make her own version with a patience that had no edge of hurry in it. He had said that a tool you made yourself was a tool that taught you something in the making, and that this was worth more than the tool itself. He had said a great many things of this kind, and she had written none of them down because she had not needed to. They were the kind of things that stay. The morning she opened the car, the surveyor Rudd was already out on the grant section, and the telegraph operator Cross had his shift at the depot, and the woman Palms was at the county courthouse, attending to whatever remained of the estate. Mrs. Hatch was in the kitchen when Nora came down in the dark of early morning, and Nora said she was going out early to attend to the car, and Mrs. Hatch said, without turning from the stove, that she would leave the breakfast wrapped in cloth on the top shelf of the larder. Nora had walked the quarter-mile from the boarding house to the siding in the dark of pre-dawn, and the frost on the ties had crunched under her boots in a way that sounded very loud in the stillness, and she had been the only person on that side of the tracks. There was a quality to the siding in that light that she had noticed before, on the occasions when she had come to study the car in daylight. The siding ran off the main line at a gentle angle, and then curved slightly and ended in a set of derailleurs that had been disconnected and left in the grass. The cars on it sat in a row that diminished in the direction away from the main line, the flatbed first, then the two cattle cars, and then at the far end, separated from the others by a gap of several car lengths, the Class B40. The gap was intentional, she had concluded. The car had been shunted to the far end of the siding deliberately, placed at the point where the siding most nearly lost itself in the weeds, at sufficient distance from the working cars that a casual observer at the depot would see the siding as occupied without paying particular attention to what it contained. Someone had put the car there with a plan in mind. The plan, as best she could reconstruct it, had been interrupted before whoever made it could come back for what was inside. She had thought about that interruption while she worked on the lock in the evenings. The date of the last ledger entry was October of 1893. The territorial revenue inspection that Colbert had mentioned had been conducted, she verified through the La Junta Records Office, in November of 1893. The timing was close enough that it was not a coincidence. Someone had known the inspection was coming and had moved the evidence off the books and off the active yard in a single action, sealing it behind a lock they believed was secure, intending to retrieve it after the inspection cleared. The inspection had cleared. And then, for reasons she could not fully reconstruct from the documents alone, the person with the key had not come back. She had asked Briscoe about this in La Junta, and he had considered the question with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He said that Walter Aldous Fry had been taken seriously ill in December of 1893, a respiratory illness that had kept him confined to his house in Pueblo through the winter, and that he had resigned from the Colorado and Southern the following February, ostensibly for reasons of health, and moved to Colorado Springs within the month. He said it was possible that by the time Fry was well enough to return to Creston, the retrieval had become too visible a risk. The inspection had passed. The revenue office was no longer in the district, but the car was still there, on a siding that was now on record as decommissioned, and any activity around it might attract the kind of attention that the original scheme had been designed to avoid. Briscoe paused and then said that it was also possible that Fry had simply decided, from the remove of Colorado Springs, that whatever was in the car was not worth the risk of going back for. The documented value on the fraudulent manifests was low. The actual value of the machinery was higher, but the machinery had by 1894 been sitting in a sealed car for more than a year, and was not easily liquidated without establishing a provenance that did not exist. The money Fry had already extracted from the scheme, the difference between the declared and actual shipping fees over 3 years, was safely deposited somewhere the revenue office would not easily find. The car was evidence, or was. Leaving it sealed was, in its way, the safest choice. The safest choice until someone bought it for $4 on a Tuesday afternoon 9 years later. What Briscoe did not say directly, but what Nora understood from the shape of what he told her, was that the lock had functioned as Fry had intended. He had placed a lock on that car that nobody in the district could open, and for 9 years, nobody had. The scheme it was meant to protect had simply outlasted its usefulness from the other direction, the evidence becoming useless to Fry because he no longer needed it, and dangerous to him because it still existed. A locked car at the end of a siding does not become less dangerous over time. It becomes, if anything, more dangerous because time is the one thing a buried wrong accumulates without limit. Nora had explained none of this to Colbert when she left the depot position. She had given him 2 days' notice, which was more than the work required, and had thanked him for the employment, which was more than the wage required. He had looked at her with the slightly narrowed attention of a man who suspects he is missing something and cannot identify what it is. She had not helped him identify it. She had walked out of the depot with her grandfather's canvas roll under her arm and a letter of appointment from the Colorado and Southern's district yard office folded in her coat pocket. The district yard position paid her a salary she could build something on. She took a room of her own in the following spring, 2 blocks from the freight office, with a window that faced east over the plains, and caught the morning light for most of the year. She kept her grandfather's tools on the desk beside the window and the lock she had opened on the sill beside them. She kept no other decoration. She did not need any. The room was the room of a person who had decided where she was and why, and it had the particular orderliness of a space that is fully occupied without being crowded. She did her work carefully and thoroughly, and with the specific quality of attention she had brought to the car on the siding, which was the quality of someone who believes that what is in front of her is worth understanding completely, and who will not leave it until she does. The freight audits she produced were precise and clean, and regularly caught the kind of discrepancy that a less attentive eye would pass. The district superintendent, a man named Holt who had taken the position from the Burlington side of the merger, told her in the first winter that she had a better eye for the structure of a manifest than anyone he had employed in 20 years. She thanked him and returned to the work. She was not in Creston for the resolution of the revenue proceeding. She was in La Junta on a freight audit assignment when Briscoe sent word that the assessment had been finalized and the property in Colorado Springs had been found sufficient. She read the letter twice and folded it and put it in the desk in her room in Creston that evening, and did not take it out again. It had said what it needed to say. There was nothing to add to it. The car itself, the Class B40, was rolled out of the Creston siding by a Colorado and Southern work crew in December of 1904, cleared for disposal after the proceeding concluded. Nora watched it go from the freight office window on a cold morning when the ground was frozen and the sky was the color of tin. The work crew chained it to a work engine and pulled it back down the siding to the main line, and it disappeared around the curve toward Pueblo. She watched until she could no longer hear the sound of the wheels on the rail, and then she went back to the audit she had been working on. The desk was still in La Junta, being held as documentary evidence. She did not know what happened to it after the proceeding. She did not ask. Reed Archer's visit to the siding had been the last time she had stood in the car's interior. She had been there perhaps a dozen times total, always with purpose, never for longer than the purpose required. She had not stood in the passage looking at the desk and the dust with anything approaching sentiment. The car wasn't a place to feel things. It was a place where things had been kept, and she had been the one to open it, and that was what it was. What she felt on the morning Archer came and stood at the open door and said what he said was something close to recognition. Not of him precisely, of what he represented, which was the human remainder of a wrong that had been committed on paper, in columns and figures, at administrative distance, by a man who had calculated that no one would ever add up what he had taken and find the sum. Archer had spent 2 years of his life trying to reconcile figures that refused to reconcile, and had eventually been told, in effect, that his own records were unreliable, and had accepted this because the alternative was to call the Colorado and Southern a liar. In a formal proceeding, he could not win without evidence he did not have. The evidence had been 30 feet away the whole time, in a car on a siding, behind a lock nobody could open, There is a patience that the world asks of people it has dismissed, and it is a different patience from the kind it asks of people it has not dismissed. It is the patience of someone who cannot simply go somewhere else with their grievance, because the evidence is sealed, and the institution that holds the records is the same institution that falsified them. Archer had kept his records for 9 years. He had kept the invoices and the shipping orders and the correspondence in a leather case in his office that he had, on at least one occasion, considered burning because looking at them had become a specific kind of pain with no visible end. He had not burned them. That was the thing Nora thought about when she watched him standing at the open door. He had not burned them. She had not asked him why. There are questions that don't need to be asked, because the answer is visible in the way a person stands at a threshold and looks at what they had stopped believing they would ever find.